بسم الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على
Hello,
رسول الله صلى الله عليه
praise
وسلم.
be to God and peace
الحضور
be upon
الكريم.
Prophet Muhammad, auspicious audience, professors, students, dear guests, may the peace and blessings of God be upon you. At the outset, allow me to extend my thanks to the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies for organizing the 6th annual meeting for Gulf Studies Forum. I would also like to express my pleasure to be here amongst you and with the same panel and professors in this sessions entitled Economic Diversification and Labor Policies in the GCC States. Under this title, we would like to tackle three important topics. Each one will be dealt with by a separate professor. These topics are about economic integration in the GCC states. It will give a general assessment and overview about integration strategies. The second topic will speak about general policies and labor policies in Qatar. The third topic will speak about inclusion and exclusion in labor policies in the GCC states. Let us delve now into the first topic. In this topic, Mr. Khalid Al-Khatir will be speaking to us. Allow me to give you a brief introduction of him, his interests, his background. He is a researcher in monetary policy and political economy science. He is also an associate researcher in the Macroeconomic Institute and the Institute for New Economic Thinking at Cambridge University. He was previously Director of Research and Monetary Policy at the QCB, and he was a member of the Committee of Monetary Policy and Committee of Investment. He was also Director of Research and Monetary Policy at Georgetown University in Qatar. He authored numerous publications, the last one entitled Challenges of Collapse of Oil Price and Economic Diversification Strategies in the GCC State, which was collected in a book entitled Economic Diversification in the GCC State, published by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Mr. Khaled, the floor is yours. I would like, for my part, to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to address you today and to speak one of the aims and objectives of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies being the economic integration. Economic integration is related to several economic challenges, one of them being the economic diversification, of course. Economic diversification remains a challenge to economic integration. We are speaking here about integration of markets in order to reach economic union, as well as energy giants inside the GCC states. We could have the GCC states as giants in the energy sectors. The Unified Economic Agreement of GCC countries concluded in 1981 aimed to unify commerce, customs, and to reach eventually a monetary union. However, it was stalled. What are the reasons why the GCC state failed in this journey? It is very important, before speaking about the reasons, it is very important to recognize that the GCC states failed in economic diversification nationally. So economic integration and economic diversification are tightly related. In my opinion, economic diversification failure goes back to the abundance of resources and the high cost. The abundance of resources inside those countries cancels the need for diversification. There is no motive for the GCC state to undertake any economic diversification. Economic diversifications has prerequisites. I call them reforms. Such reforms, if implemented well, will lead to political consequences. The first reform is to build the human resources. The second prerequisite, or the second prerequisite, is to build the private and public sectors. Those reforms will undermine the rentier system or the rentier approach in the GCC states, thus leading to a mutilation in the political regime with time. This was proved to be true in the Asian countries as well in the European countries. After the Industrial Revolution, a private sector, a business sector emerged. It was independent from the state and continuously evolving. So this placed pressure on the state, and we've seen lobbyists pressuring the state to go back to the previous regime, because the new mutilation caused drastic demographic changes. So here in the GCC states, we are still relying on our abundant resources, and it is better to keep it as it is for now. Economic diversification failed. So how can we achieve economic integration? There is no way for trade or commercial integration inside the GCC states. The GCC states export oil, and in return they import the commodities they need, and therefore commercial integration wasn't achieved unless at 10% maybe. Failed commercial integration also led to failed industrial integration. The GCC state failed in achieving industrial integration. Instead, despite of having a good perspectives like integration at the level of transportation system, gas system, etc. Even at the level of electricity network. Now integration is limited to emergencies, but it wasn't tested. Qatar proposed to build a huge power station at the border between Qatar and KSA to provide electricity to these two states, and it can be developed later to reach Jordan. This proposition was refused and rejected by KSA. There was also a proposition to establish a desalination plant with Oman or along Oman borders. Also another plan to achieve railway connectivity. Also a bridge between Qatar and Bahrain. All these projects and propositions were stalled and halted due to the tension between Qatar and KSA. So there was also a proposition or a vision to achieve a custom-free trade between the GCC countries, also a unified currency like the Eurozone countries, but the GCC states failed in all these endeavors. Why? Because contrary to Europe, there was no political will to achieve such integration and such a union. Hans Müller, the German counselor, recently spoke about the monetary union and how it was essential to reach a war-free Europe after World War II. So, economic integration plans and strategy rest on a political will factor, and also Qatar has achieved great success in oil trade worldwide, but it also failed at the GCC level. Before Qatar invested in the largest infrastructure for gas transportation, it proposed such a gas network between the GCC states, but this proposition was rejected by the KSA. There was plans also to supply gas to Bahrain and Kuwait through gas pipelines that go through KSA. However, this plan was hindered. An agreement was also signed to supply Kuwait with Qatari gas for 25 years, but Kuwait failed to convince KSA to buy in to this plan. Qatar said that the king of Bahrain complained about KSA disrupting the supply of gas to Bahrain from Qatar as well, but all efforts to pressure KSA failed, and therefore Bahrain was obliged to negotiate with Iran to supply gas. For KSA, supplying Qatar gas posed a less threat than supplying Iranian gas, but still KSA rejected the plan. Qatari gas, we reached a point where Qatari gas was exported to European country where it was re-exported to a neighboring GCC country. So this is complicated. In my opinion, why would KSA hinder the exportation of oil and gas within GCC states? In my opinion, there are three parties to this: Qatar, KSA, and the neighboring countries. In my opinion, for Qatar to supply or to export gas and oil to neighboring countries will reinvigorate its position in the region, and it will present Qatar as a political power in the region. It will further strengthen the relation of Qatar with other states. It will also save costs for Qatar relating to infrastructure, and it will provide Qatar with a strength source. So this is in theory. How will the neighboring countries will be affected? They will be able to import oil and gas at lower cost. They will be able to make desalination plans to generate electricity, etc. So etc. So for the neighboring countries as well, it will be a strength point to them, and it will reinvigorate their position in the region. It will also promote for the independence of these states, independence from KSA influence and hegemony, and this stands true in the case of Bahrain. Regarding the KSA, which exports oil and consumes energy, its own oil will be exported at a higher price if Qatar were a competition for it. So it will affect social welfare as well inside KSA. Oil crisis will be imminent in Qatar. Some studies also signal that KSA needs for the barrel price to go up to 170 US dollars and further to 320 US dollars by 2030. These figures are alarming because they indicate that KSA fails in economic diversification and fully rely on oil exportation, and therefore they need to raise the price of the barrel, and therefore they fight any efforts or any endeavors to export oil at lower cost. Some studies also speak that if KSA cannot export oil by 2030, all the oil will be consumed locally due to the increasing demand. All these pressures inside KSA in particular will force the GCC state to import oil from Russia or from USA, knowing that Qatar has large oil fields and gas fields. This is really confusing. Why are we fighting Qatar? And I can only point out to one reason here: politics. Only creating a GCC market for the Qatari gas will reinvigorate Qatar's position in the market and will undermine Saudi position. Therefore, KSA has rejected such plans, and because those plans will strengthen the position of smaller GCC countries like Bahrain. So if we are to draw a conclusion from all this, we can say that the reasons for failure is the lack of a unified vision or a strategic objective for all the GCC states. There are a tension and lack of trust amongst the GCC states. Some are reluctant to strengthen the position of other states, like the case of Qatar gas and how it would undermine KSA influence in the region. KSA now is the largest country, and it has the most border points shared with GCC states, and therefore it seeks to preserve its position. It also traditionally has expansion ambitions, and it has ambitions to strengthen its influence and hegemony in the region, and therefore whenever we have development plans, KSA will not encourage them. Also, in such a state, states, there's a tendency to nurture a nationalism, knowing that such a nationalism is delusional, it is fake. This doesn't encourage inclusion, it doesn't encourage integration. Also, because a currency union will undermine sovereignty for some states, like I mentioned. So, the abundance of natural resources, the heavy reliance on such resources leads to the lack of will to diversify the economy, and thus the lack of will to achieve economic integration. Also, mistrust amongst GCC states has prevailed. There's a constant tendency for some larger GCC states to keep their hegemony on smaller ones. One final point: where is Qatar a blockade amongst all these factors? Qatar a blockade is a consequence of this mistrust and the desire to preserve this hegemony by the KSA and the UAE recently. And therefore, the Qatar blockade has exposed those countries. They exposed their ambitions, they exposed their expansion strategies and their hegemony, and this will affect smaller GCC states in the future. It will also influence plans for for economic integration in the future. That is it. I will not linger on. Thank you for your attention, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Khalid, I would like to thank you for showing us that political will is always the decisive factor, and it poses a challenge to the ambitions of some states, and it entrenches the hegemony of other states, and it hinders objectives of economic integration. The case of Qatar, or the experience of Qatar after the blockade, has exposed the ambitions of such states, and it showed that economic integration poses a threat on such hegemonial states. When you are advancing or proposing plans, you assume that those plans should be bought into by a neighboring state, but you are surprised that other states are rejecting such plans just because they do not want to Qatar to strengthen its position.
So I will move now to the second speaker, who will give a paper entitled Public Policy Problems, Labor Policies in Qatar. The paper will be given by Mr. Radwan Termanini. He is a researcher, international economist. He previously worked as an economic researcher in several countries, including Kuwait, the UAE, and the US. He also has served on the boards of several international companies in Egypt, Morocco, Syria, and Bahrain, and has served on international economic boards and councils in the UK and Turkey. He has published many papers in the field of economy. Doctor, I give you the floor. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies and the organizers of the 6th Annual Gulf Studies Forum for inviting me to talk about the public policy problems in the labor market, labor policies in Qatar. I had the honor of living in some Arab countries for a number of decades, and this allowed me to get to know the economic life in these countries, including the policies and what is currently known as public strategies, how they are made, how they are implemented in such countries. And many times we talk about the importance of the oil sector, and is the main driver of the various economic sectors in all GCC states. It was actually a main factor in alleviating the burden in these countries because of the large number of expatriates, and as a result, the impact on the demographic environment in these states. This made these countries to issue demographic policies or population policies, but interest did not exceed this level, to the level that the labor market deserved with regards to these population policies, demographic policies. In my paper, I would like to look further based on the documented failures to a certain extent to some of these policies, mainly in the state of Qatar, in order to provide a different track that is based on a concept that goes in par with a wider vision for a balanced development rather than sterile development, and that really faces the challenges, the true challenges of the labor policies in the state. The main cause of the failure of these policies in achieving their aims is that their drafting really did not face the true challenges, the actual challenges, and in this paper I will shed light on three main tracks or pillars. The first pillar is the specificities and characteristics of the Qatar labor markets, drafting public policies and public strategies related to labor markets. The third pillar is the challenges of the labor market. Public policies in the GCC started in the 70s, but the making of such policies really included a lot of ambiguity. It was not clear how public policies are made, how these policies change, who decides which policies should be implemented. The failure of some policies in implementing sustainable development and in diversifying economy. The first pillar, the characteristics of the labor market in Qatar. The labor market in Qatar is based on supply and demand. Of course, the supply is foreign workers, and demand are the Qataris. In 2016, between we had the active laborers included 101,000, and non-active workers more than 90,000. It was divided between students, housewives, unemployed, employed. The characteristics of the labor markets is that they are novice and faces demographic and social factors, multiple factors, including the degrees of birth rates and The demand characteristics or request characteristics comes mainly from the private sector. It was concentrated in the real estate and construction sector. The demand for Qatari labor was mainly in the government sector, public sector, be it males or females. What is the nature of the labor market? First, the lack of training, of course, the imbalance between supply and demand led to a gap in the market. The demand for labor is very flexible because the ability of importing labor and mainly the labor, the workers in Qatar are expatriates. Many researchers use the term of migrant workers, but this concept does not apply to Qatar because these workers are imported workers for a given period of time. This led to structuring to the financial market based on four sectors between males and females with regards to Qatari workers, males and females for migrant workers, and this structure does not allow to a rotation of workers between the four mentioned sectors. The importance of the gap in the labor market. If we consider that demand for workers in 2016 was around 2 million persons, the national workforce did not exceed 101,000. This led to a gap of approximately 2 million in the labor market divided between males and females, 88% for males and 12% for females. We move to the second track, drafting public policies. Public policies in Qatar are characterized mainly is that they are related with the rentier state policies. Second, the large wealth, development of infrastructure and social infrastructure, but this quick change and development really did not allow the state to have efficient policies put in place in time. The main strategies and policies, there are a lot of policies and strategies. We will concentrate on two main policies, the first population policy and the second population policy. The first population policy was established or drafted in order to face the imbalance in the labor market, defining the labor market, and includes programs that face demographic change, but it does not delve into details with regards to the labor market. The aim of this policy is to have a balance in population, and a balance between population and the available resources, and developing the Qatari family and household. The objectives of the second population policies were changing. It concentrated more on facing the challenges of the increase of population and the population structure, demographic structure in the state, and facing the challenges related to Qatari and non-Qatari population and citizens. The remarks on this population policy, it does not differentiate between labor market and the population. It does not cater to future labor challenges that require more balance on the demographic level. And it does not shed light on the necessity of developing the workers and how this impacts the labor market in the state. What are the results of these policies on the demand of the labor force? First, it increased the rates of participation in the age groups of citizens, increased training on the level of national or Qatari workers, be it for females or males. What are the results on the level of demand? The sectoral distribution is still related to the public sector. The professional distribution led to a fixed demand on marginal workers, especially household workers. This really consecrated the quarterly division of the sectors in the state. The third pillar, the future challenges of the labor market. Some strategies that were drafted really had limited success, but this success was not enough, and we are still facing a number of problems. These strategies have succeeded to a certain limit in finding solution on the level of the public sector, but it was not successful on the level of the private sector. What are the challenges or the actual challenges facing the labor policies? We have 5 main challenges. First, recycling workers, over training the workers, and the Qatarization policies. These challenges are related with the ability of increasing the level of demand and decreasing the level of supply. The first challenge, recycling in general, it is redistributing the workers that are currently present in Qatar. This will also solve some challenges, but it does not affect the gap in the labor worker, because this means that really just redistributing foreign workers from one place to the other. The second challenge is the use of present resources in an optimal manner. The Qatar, of course, has a strong financial position, but we know that we have a challenge on the level of absorption, the capacity of the economy to recycle or redistribute the workers. Second, the capacity of the labor market to absorb the large number of migrant workers and how it influences the social and economic structure of the state. The financial factors led to entrenching this imbalance in the economic structure of Qatar, especially on the level of the labor market, and this led to increased the dependence on migrant workers. The importance of this challenge lies in the necessity of linking between the economic capacity and the gap of the labor market. The third challenge is unemployment and overemployment. The level of unemployment in Qatar is among the lowest in the world. It is less than 1%. Unemployment as an economic phenomenon is not really an important factor. The imbalance in the labor market is not linked to the unemployment phenomenon, but is related with overemployment that is organically linked with economic and demographic factors. This imbalance led to a gap that was bridged by importing a large number of migrant workers, which is, of course, we know it is a temporary import for temporary workers that are not in this case considered as migrant workers. The fourth challenge is the virtual labor force. The virtual labor force is an additional reserve. It amounts to 60,000, especially it is a large rate in comparison with the Qatari labor force, which is 110,000. So the virtual labor force is approximately half of the actual or current labor force. It is made up of unemployed, those who are not employed. These are Qataris who are in the age of work, whether males or females, but they do not want to enter into the labor market. The fifth challenge, the Qatarization policy. Of course, providing jobs to Qataris is a priority for the government in the state of Qatar. And the issue of Qatarization at present is not of great concern, but it has become an unjustified obsession in the minds of some. Some observers believe that the Qatari policy failed in achieving its goals and led to negative repercussions. The importance of the challenge lies in two truths. The size of the Qatari labor force with regards to quantity and quality does not go in par with the needs of the labor market. And the public spending. The conclusion. Most literature described important workers as market workers and led to a problem in drafting proper labor policies. These workers are not migrant workers. They are important workers and temporary workers. The demand of workers really is a main factor that delineates the shape of the labor market. It is the main factor in determining the population of the state, be it citizens or expatriates, and not vice versa. The demographic problem is a result of the strategy of work strategies. The national policies have faced problems in drafting strategy in policies and programs because of the lack of implementation programs that are focused on certain sectors. The dependence of the consecration of a system that does not provide accurate work. The policies, the demand of workers in Qatar depends, of course, on public spending, which is related to export as a main driver. For the aforementioned sectors, the work policies require more stability, more sustainability. These policies should be studied in depth in order to provide the future demands for workers that will go in par with the needs of the labor market in Qatar. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Termanini, for this paper that tackled the labor policies in the state of Qatar. You talked about foreign workers, about imported workers, the challenges of the labor markets that are challenges of the labor market in the state of Qatar. If the relation between economic development, economic resources, and population are tightly linked, if we want to increase and promote economic development in a state, we need more resources, especially human resources. The more human resources we need, the more imbalance we create in the economic structure and demographic structure, because citizens should play an important role in achieving this economic development. This is on one side. On the other side, when we increase the number of foreign workers, what is the cost versus the economic benefit and economic revenue that we will be producing by using such foreign workers? These are really delicate economic questions that requires research in order to create a balance between the market need and between the supply and demand in order to achieve efficiency on the level of the economy, and to find an optimal model in order to cater to the needs of sustainable development. I will now move to our third speaker in this session, Dr. Ahmed Aref. Dr. Aref will talk about patterns of social inclusion and exclusion in Gulf labor policy shifts, and he will tackle evidence from Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Mr. Aref is a public policy researcher at the Doha International Family Institute and a member of the Qatar Foundation for Education, Science and Community Development. He previously worked at the UN Population Fund Regional Office in Cairo. His research focuses on analysis of public policy in the Arab region with concentration on Gulf studies. He has published numerous studies, policy papers and reports on social care and labor policy in the Gulf and the political economy of foreign aid. Dr. Ahmed, please take the floor.
I am pleased to be given this opportunity to discuss issues relating to general policy, public policy, and how it relates to situations nowadays. My topic today is about a comparison between Qatar and the KSA. I will not go into a theoretic debate about inclusion and exclusion, but I will pick up from where Dr. Mohamad stopped about foreign workers, provisional or temporary workers, and hired workers. These concepts sum up the problematics of social exclusion and exclusion in the GCC states. As we all know, the labor structure in the GCC states has demographic imbalances between nationals and expatriates. Expatriates are described in the migration policies, but even expatriates, the word expatriates may be inaccurate in the policies. An expatriate could be a migrant, but in a public policy, the more accurate word would be resident, because expatriates in the GCC states are third-generation descendants. Their ancestors were were the first to come here in the GCC, and perhaps they belong more to the GCC country, and they consider it to be their homeland more than their own country of origin. Therefore, there are economic and social approaches to such migration and foreign labor. Most importantly, to capture the social inclusion and exclusion patterns in the GCC states. So capturing such patterns and was focused on in the paper. The paper also focused on the last 5 years in the GCC states, where drastic mutilations took place inside the market due to several factors and causes. And we will be delving into such causes and factors. However, the study raises an important question. When we look into the context of the labor policy shifts inside the GCC states, we see similarities between the countries, especially at the level of the economic model and failures thereof. However, the response of the GCC countries to such labor policy shifts was particularly interesting, especially when it comes to the diverse approaches to labor policies. So they took diverse approaches. Some like Qatar took an inclusive approach, social inclusive approach. Other countries like KSA preferred exclusion. Why did the KSA prefer exclusion over inclusion? Let us have a macro level analysis of the context-related challenges in labor policy shifts in the GCC states. First, there is the demographic imbalance, the demographic gap. And this has to do with either recent challenges or constant permanent challenges. So there are disparities inside the GCC states at the level of population. GCC states combined have 50% expatriates or residents and 50% nationals. So the population is divided 50-50. And these statistics are taken from the GCC stat. However, GCC stat doesn't provide accurate statistics on Qatar, UAE, and KSA because such statistics are deemed sensitive. And we relied on other academic institutes and statistics institutes. In Qatar, statistics point out that 14% of the population are nationals at best, and in UAE 16% of the population are nationals. Reasons thereof, the declining fertility rate. And here I would like to point out that fertility rate has declined in general in all countries. In blue you can see the nationals population, and those are the population that are of interest to to policy makers. In Qatar, between 2004 and 2017, fertility rate has decreased to nearly 2%. If we continue such a decline, we are speaking about 30% decline over 13 years. And this is alarming at a national level because it requires intervention at the level of policy making, as it poses a national security threat. Mr. Uthman Abdelaziz Al Khalifa in the morning spoke about such a challenge. Governmental revenues in the GCC states are mainly driven by hydrocarbon sector revenues. Non-hydrocarbon sectors are sectors that are only here to serve the hydrocarbon sector. In 2015 and after the international decline of oil prices, statistics showed that GCC state also witnessed a 20% decline in their GDP. Aramco lost 50% of their production in the KSA. So economy is fragile. It is tightly related to international prices, and this model is tightly linked to policy making, and this is what we call the curse of resources, because citizens now have to inherit have the mindset that they inherit their natural resources and they are entitled to such revenues and rents. And this poses a burden on the state, as now they have to find a way to sustain this model. Security and political challenges, we will not speak about such challenges in detail because they have to do with diplomacy in general and not internal affairs. However, we can say that when military spending increases, it will be at the detriment of social spending. For example, in the GCC states, a military and security crisis led that KSA expenditures increase by 192%, and the KSA ranked third in military expenditures worldwide. Qatar was also ranked third in importing military equipment. This, like I said, has a financial and economic bill to it that society and social policies will bear. Here we have a case of similarity between GCC countries, especially when it comes to labor policy making. We will capture shifts inside Qatar and KSA, but before we speak about the exclusion policies in KSA and the inclusion policies in Qatar, let us take a brief overview of the national context that prompted these two countries to take either of those to adopt either of those models. In the KSA, shifts are driven by the leadership change itself. Since 2017, Mohamad bin Salman has been at the top of the reigns inside KSA. He was the crown prince, but he was in fact the person taking up the reins of the country, and this undermined the legitimacy of KSA. Since the establishment of KSA in 1745, so since the kingdom, the nowadays kingdom of Saudi Arabia was established in 1745, there was a legitimacy given to the Wahhabi and the tribalism regime. So Mohammed bin Salman came to leadership with an exclusion mindset. He excluded tribes. He incarcerated religious personalities, and so he undermined this structure that the kingdom was established on for decades. He destroyed a 30 years of Wahhabi heritage and tribalism heritage. He also undermined or weakened the influence of the نهي عن المعروف authority and joining a bad authority. So the legitimacy of the regime was shaken, and he described it as dying legitimacy. And therefore now a progressive task model was enforced since July 2017, and the tax keeps progressing until reaching 400 Saudi riyals on every breadwinner of a Saudi household residing within a KSA. So this tax policy, policy prompted several households to go back to their home country. And we have seen a collective departure or repatriation, if I may say, of workers residing in KSA, and 1,600,000 person were arrested for breaching work permits. International human rights organizations described such actions as non-humanitarian. What was the new model that Mohammed bin Salman adopted? It is a radical model. So ever since he took office, he enforced, like I said, a progressive tax, and he Saudized 12 retail sectors. And in 2017, when these policies were adopted, the state in general was weakened. Saudization was later decreased or brought down for 100% to 70%, given the failure in achieving 100% percentage. The approach was one resting on exclusion in the KSA. By contrast, in Qatar, the policy labor shifts that we will tackle are built on inclusion. Why? There are several drivers for that. From 2010 and after, Qatar has won the organization bid of the FIFA. International organizations such as ILO and Amnesty International started to examine sponsorship, the kafala system, the labor conditions in sites like weather conditions, etc. So we can say that Qatar was under the spotlight, under scrutiny. There were international criticism regarding labor policies in Qatar made driven by international labor rights organizations. So Qatar had to take action that we will later speak of. In the June 5th crisis, Qatar had to respond in two ways. At the level of the official speech, for example, in the UN General Assembly meeting in 2018, the prince, quote unquote, said that he takes pride in his people. So there were like a social solidarity among the citizens to respond to this crisis. There was also solidarity among decision makers, and the campaign known as Tamim the Glory. Such a crisis led led to a bundle of responses or initiatives. Like Mr. Abdelaziz from QNB said in the morning, uh, Qatar had to survive through the blockade crisis. It had to keep brandishing its identity as a state opened to the exterior. When leadership changed, when we speak about leadership change in KSA and the exclusion model, we have to speak about leadership in Qatar and the inclusion model in Qatar. I have a difficulty playing the video. However, in the 48th meeting of the Shura Council, His Highness spoke about the presence of residents, and he didn't use the word expatriates, so his speech in itself is inclusive. Let's see now how labor policies have drastically shifted. There were legislations to cancel the sponsorship, the kafala system, and the labor law, and after stagnation or slowdown in amending this labor law, we have seen a slowdown in amending the law 14 of 2014 relating to the private sector. Amendments Amendments were made in several laws, namely the Law 14 of 2014, the Law of 2015 pertaining to regulating the entry and exit of foreign workers. Also, a law pertaining to the contractual relationship between the employer and employee, where the wages of employees were amended. Also, grievance and complaints mechanisms were formed and adopted. Also, new amendments pertaining to transferring the Iqama from one employer to another. In Qatar in 2017, the legislator enacted a law for domestic workers that provides entitlements to the domestic workers and imposes sanctions and penalties on employers in case of breach of employees' workers. We also have Law 10 of 2018 pertaining to permanent Iqama, permanent residence, which provided or afforded permanent residence to some vulnerable or specific cases of residents in Qatar, namely those who are residing in Qatar for over 20 years now, and to spouses of non-Qatari spouses of non-Qataris who are now able to transfer their nationality to their spouses. There is also in the previous law, non-Qataris have only limited ownership, whereby a Qatari national should be a partner at 51%. This is coupled with additional policies such as children of expatriates have the right now to work in the country without transferring their Iqama. In KSA, we've seen that the state has adopted an exclusion model, and how Qatar has adopted a rather inclusive model, especially over the past 5 years. So also social inclusion has no limitations in Qatar, despite the criticism that Qatar still witnesses at the level of the labor law. The law limited the number of persons applying and receiving Iqama annually to 100 only, but there are efforts now to move forward with such limitations and perhaps cancel such limitations. Thank you, Mr. Ahmed, for your presentation in which you have spoken about exclusion and inclusion at the level of labor policies, and you drew a parallel between Qatar and KSA in this regard. You showed how residents in Qatar are enjoying a rather privileged position compared to residents in KSA, and His Highness speech in the UN General Assembly said that he took pride in his people. He also spoke about residents and not about expatriates. Labor policies in Qatar did not adopt nationalization, and by that I mean they didn't replace expatriates with nationals. Policies were rather inclusive, and they afforded equality and justice to expatriates. They treated them well. They didn't treat them with any superiority tendency. So foreigners or expatriates in Qatar felt secure, and I'm not only speaking about job security, but they also felt societal security. Thank you, Mr. Aref. I will open the floor now to Q&As. We only have 20 minutes for this session, so let us stick to the time, please.
Name and please limit your question to one sentence. Qatar University, Dr. Badran. At the onset, I would like to thank the speakers for their papers. My question is to Dr. Khalid Al-Khatir. You've indicated the role of political will and its impact on integration between GCC states. It is an internal variable. What about external variables? And there are certain foreign countries really do not encourage the emergence of new powers in the state, and how this might influence the relation between GCC states. Thank you. Thank you. Nizar Jwidi, Public Policy Department Arab Center, from the Arab Center for Research and Policy, Dr. Khatir, and the political aspect that you've mentioned with regard that led to putting obstacles in the face of economic diversification is perhaps this is at face value. There are a deeper explanation. You've mentioned that KSA wants to keep the oil prices high. On the other hand, perhaps the exporting gas to European countries will lead to a decrease in the price of the oil barrel, and this was not beneficial for the KSA. The second thing, you have military economic diversification to the oil and gas or to the hydrocarbon sector, but in the economy there are other things. Perhaps the non-integration between Qatar and KSA and GCC countries is a factor here. Another factor is a lack of incentive among GCC states to move towards economic integration because their economies are competitive, because their economies have the same structure, perhaps. Thank you. Hiba Farid from Sudan. My first question to Mr. Khalid. The example that you gave with regards to economic diversification is the same like the previous speaker mentioned, is also with regards to the energy sector and hydrocarbon sector. And despite the fact of the abundance of natural resources, the issue is sustainability and the risk of what we faced in the oil crisis when the oil barrel price decreased. Do you believe there is a will on the level of the states to implement economic diversification? Because there is no true will on the level of the GCC states. There will not have an economy based on diversification. We see that how in the East, for example, and Asia, the powers grew, how they started producing, how the states started producing their needs, and how this complemented. So the integration and complement policy is very important. With regards to the last speaker, the question is in exclusion and inclusion. For example, the tax levied on per head, like we say in KSA, and how it affected the purchase power and how it affected the SMEs. So we need a more detailed analysis. But with regard to the state of Qatar, is there a will for inclusion? Because the inclusion has indicators. You've mentioned reform and the level of legislation and laws, at the level of funding, of ownership. There are different indicators, as you know, with regards to inclusion. Is there an actual will for inclusion? What is the level of inclusion? Because if there is a political will for inclusion, as you have mentioned in your paper, it should be limited to a level of inclusion to be apparent in the indicators. What are the indicators that did not show any improvement on the level of inclusion in the state of Qatar? The fourth and last question. Can you please ask a question to Dr. Mohamad, to Dr. Termini?
Good morning. My name is Leslie Powell. I'm the Dean of the College of Public Policy at Hamad bin Khalifa University. Please forgive me for asking my question in English, but respond in Arabic. It's to our last speaker, Dr. Aref. And this may be somewhat unfair, but I'm just wondering what the tendency is vis-a-vis inclusion or exclusion with respect to the UAE or other Gulf states.
Fahad Al-Fadala. My question is to Dr. Ahmed with regards to exclusion. We always call for reform in the labor market, right? If Mohamad bin Salman, MBS, implemented reform in the labor market, do you call that exclusion? You've compared between two labor markets that are very different with regards to the economic force, workers, size of the market between Qatar and KSA. Despite that, I disagree with them on a lot of issues, but he is reforming, MBS is reforming the labor market for the benefit of the citizens. With regards to Mr. Mohamad, Dr. Termanini, and the labor market in Qatar, you talked about a failure in labor policies. I don't see how there are failure in labor policies while we are the first on the level of indicators with regards to sustainable development in the Gulf. And we have high indicators in housing, education, lifestyle, economy, health. So how do you say that we have a failure on the level of labor policies? Dr. Khaled. Do you want to answer all the questions together or one by one? The role of external forces. Perhaps there is a role for external forces. What do you want external forces to do more? Perhaps it is not of the interest of some countries to have diversification in our countries, because this way we will not be importing more from them. But I want to say that we are playing a more effective role than external forces. I did not say that KSA wants to keep the oil price high. I said it needs it because of the economic situation. Observers and researchers say that if KSA does not diversify its economy, and you know it is very hard to diversify in a short period of time, the studies show that with the oil boom and the oil revolution, these states did not concentrate on diversify. They rather more concentrated just on the oil and hydrocarbon sector. You talked about, I talked only about energy projects because they were the major projects, but diversification failed. This failure led to a lack of trade integration. Sorry. We talked about diversification in economy, the projects that are on the table, and I talked about how these projects failed. I did not say that diversification only should be implemented in this sector, but I've just mentioned that this is an important sector that needed diversification. What is the cause of the failure of diversification? I think the reason is we do not have, we are still not ready to have diversification and the implications of diversification, because the diversification will lead to a change on the political level, on the commercial level. There is saturation, there is a structure for these economy. It is not easy to implement diversification. We always hear talk about promoting human resources and economic diversification in all the states. There are efforts, but as the proverb says, how can we? There's a lot of talk, but there's little action. So we have always to look we always concentrate on supply, which is supplying human resources. You can, for example, You can build research centers, you can attract international and foreign universities. All of this is for exhibition, for show. But the education system, the primary education system, is it good? Let's say it is good. Now, let's look at the demand. Where does this graduate go after he graduates? You've trained him, you've educated him. Where does it? What about the labor forces, the rentier state? There are a lot of gaps, corruption. Does this graduate move to the private sector as well? This private sector that prefers foreign workers more than local workers. So what about? So, or this graduate will only believe that this is an oil state, and you have the right to be supported by the state, and everyone will work in the state, whether you are an excellent graduate or you just don't work. All the citizens of these states, because they are wealthy states, will have a portion of this wealth. This is the problem that I am talking about with regards to building a human capital. We need to relook and to re-examine how we are managing our economy, how we are managing our human capital in the GCC states. Thank you. Dr. Mohamad, with regards to the reverse result between human development indicators, the high human development indicators in the Gulf states, and as you've mentioned, there is a failure in labor policies. We have differentiate between media, the information we gather from the media, and between facts. If the facts are the correct information, this is what we have to keep in mind. The information I've mentioned with regards to the failure of some policies, these are not related if we take into consideration the policies and the goals that have been set to be implemented. The first population policy and the second population policy. The first policy was not assessed over a period of 4 years. I have not seen any formal assessment or evaluation of these policies. The introduction of the second population policy states that the failure of the first policy drove us to take into consideration different indicators. The figures that are mentioned in the media do not reflect facts all the time, but the government data, the documents that we have at hand, whether those published or unpublished, show different facets. I've mentioned that as a constructive criticism. I am not criticizing policies, but from the analytical and scientific perspective, some policies failed because they did not achieve the goals that they were established to achieve. Mr. Aref, I will start with Dr. Hiba with regards to the percentage of inclusion and whether there is a will for inclusion. I believe that the rational answer, if there is no political will for inclusion, we wouldn't have witnessed all this development on the level of legislation. We are not talking about interference from CSOs, NGOs, or awareness campaigns. I am talking about a mere decrease, about amendments in the legislation, amendments in the laws and the legal structure of the state. Hence, there is a political will that stands behind these developments with regards to the percentage of social inclusion. Social inclusion and social exclusion is a term that is more political than academic. If you took terms such as democratization, you will be able to get a list of indicators, and we can measure measure the percentage of democratization, social inclusion. We have an in-group and out-group theory. There is a group. Are you inside this group or outside of this group? Truth of the matter, and the classification of groups as such includes concepts of discrimination and marginalization. There is continuous mobility. There is no static assumption that there is exclusion or inclusion. Talking about percentage is not could not be accurate on the level of social exclusion and inclusion. Professor Leslie Pal.
Shift to English, so you
He will be
take
answering
off
in
the,
English.
Earphones. Just to answer your question in English, at the initial stage of my research project, I started by looking at the the trends of social inclusion and exclusion among the 6 GCC countries. But why I selected Qatar and Saudi Arabia in specific? Because both cases are representing the most extreme model in terms of social inclusion in Qatar, in terms of social exclusion in Saudi Arabia. In between, there are kind of trends of social inclusion and exclusion, but it's not extreme like it is very clear and obvious in the 2 outstanding phases. In United Arab Emirates, there is a trend of social inclusion, but it has been started maybe since more than a decade. So the frequency of the labor policy transformation in terms of labor law at the past 5 years with the periodic phase of my research, which did not witness that much development in United Arab Emirates. Maybe the development in United Arab Emirates was prior to my research period, this 5 years. In Kuwait, for example, there's the political narrative of social exclusion. If you look at a parliamentarian like Safa Hashim, she called in the parliament to take taxes against expats on breathing Kuwaiti air, on using Kuwaiti roads. So this kind of, exclusive also and a political narrative of social exclusion has been debated in the parliament, but was not reflected in the actual policy transformation. So that's why, and to narrow down my scope of research, I focused on the 2 most extreme kind of models in this momentum. آخر سؤال للأستاذ الدكتور من المعهد.
The last question, in truth, if you look at the point of view of the policy maker, everything is justified. Of course, the reforms that took place in KSA are justified, and their justification stems from the high level of unemployment KSA in comparison to Qatar. 80% of residents work in the private sector, i.e. there is a high concentration of resident workers in the private sector. This justifies the reason why policymakers promote Saudization. My role as a researcher is to be objective, to monitor. While looking on the issue, I did not look at the issue from the point of view of the policymaker, but from the point of view of social and inclusion and exclusion. And if you look at the issue from this point, you will see that the radical Saudization in the last 5 years really affected the status of residents in KSA and how many resident families left KSA, and the issue of deportation, the large amount of deportation that took place in KSA. More than 1 million individuals were deported from KSA. All of that I've looked into all of that, not only from the point of view of reform like the policymaker does, and it is his right. But from another point of view, I've looked at it from the point of view of social inclusion and exclusion with regards to the rights of workers. We'll take another wave of questions. Dr. Fahd Al-Nasser, University of Kuwait. My question is to Mr. Ahmed Aref. You've mentioned in your presentation that the level of fertility and how it affects demographics. The increase or decrease of fertility rates is not only a GCC phenomenon or Qatar phenomenon, it's an international phenomenon. It also related to the small size of the family. There are many countries that have faced this phenomenon and that have issued laws and legislation in order to increase the number of family members, the size of the family, by providing, for example, monthly wages for families, providing houses to large families. Unfortunately, social changes are stronger than these policies. It is an international, worldwide phenomenon that is related to the social changes that we are witnessing in our societies and communities. These policies are not effective, especially that the trend now is smaller families and there is a decrease in fertility rates. Do you have any point of view on this matter with regards to the size of the family in Qatar? Good morning. Mubarak Al-Khairi, Ministry of Transportation and Communication. I have a question to Mr. Ahmed with regards to World Cup in Qatar and how it shed light on the issue of rights of workers in Qatar. Did the World Cup really just accelerated the implementation or the improvement of labor rights in Qatar? With regards to the to hiring professional and non-professional migrant workers. The main reason, of course, for that is oil and gas. In the 80s and 70s, when the oil boom began in Qatar, did we have an effective policy in choosing the quality of foreign workers? For example, we have employed foreign experts in order to help us in the oil and gas sector. Did we have a policy for hiring foreign workers? Good morning. My question is to Dr. Ahmed Aref. Between the exclusion and inclusion policies of the GCC states, if we take the Omani case, of course, the Omani workers are higher than resident workers, as you've mentioned. The Omani workers are 54% of the labor markets. We have a based on our national policies and the guidelines of Sultan Qaboos, he limited the rate of foreign workers in Oman to be only 30%. Do you believe this is an exclusion policy in Oman? When you have, for example, when we have, what do you believe, especially that we have professional Omani workers that are working in Oman, do you believe that the policy that we are implementing in Oman is an exclusion policy or an inclusion policy? Good morning. Question to Dr. Mohamad. You've mentioned that the unemployment rate in Qatar is less than 1%. It is the least in the world, and we have a high level of unemployment. You are talking about implicit unemployment. How are we talking about implicit unemployment, and you are also at the same time saying that we have less than 1% unemployment, excess unemployment in Qatar? And with regards to fertility rates, perhaps in Qatar we have a low fertility rates, but there are other countries in the world where this rate is actually nil. As Dr. Ahmed, when we talked about Saudization, really I differ a lot. I do not agree with the Saudi policies, but in Qatar, for example, you're saying that in Qatar, we do not have unemployment. The Qatari citizens are wealthy. In Saudi, there's a high unemployment as well. There's a lot of poverty among citizens in Saudi Arabia. If we looked at it scientifically, in Qatar, 85%, we have 85% of residents, while the level of residents in Saudi Arabia is less than that. In Saudi Arabia, we have a lower number of course, residents, but we have poverty, we have unemployment. While in Qatar, we have a higher number of residents that have helped in building Qatar, and these residents also are wealthy, are being given their rights in Qatar. How do you explain that? Thank you. With regards to the issue of the state of Qatar and the policies and general policy of the state of Qatar, I believe that Mr. Mohamad mentioned the issue of imbalance in the labor policies. The first national development strategy in Qatar has indicated this matter, and this imbalance have been catered to. The second, and this was taken into consideration in the second national development strategy. The second question, with regards to the policies you've mentioned and the imbalance in these policies or the positive aspects of these policies, how can this reflect on governance? In the end, this assessment, in one way or another, should be used in order to manage public projects. For example, if diversification fails on the level of the Gulf states, and Dr. Khalid has mentioned that in his intervention, how does this reflect on the decisions to be taken in the public sector? Also, how will we deal with the imbalance and the gap in the labor market? Also, with what Dr. Ahmed referred to with regards to inclusion and exclusion, especially in the state of Qatar, how will these challenges reflect on governance in the state? We will begin with Dr. Ahmed. I will start answering Dr. Nasser with regards to fertility rates. Even though We are moving away here from the issue of exclusion and inclusion because fertility rates is an international phenomenon, and Qatar is part of this international phenomenon. I'm a researcher at LPI with regards to the fertility rates in Qatar. There are many structural components that led to a decrease in fertility rates. Most of them are cultural and social factors related to the fast pace of life, balancing between family life and work. Also, there are factors with regards to the cost of raising children. There are also the level of female education. This is a positive indicator with regards to female empowerment, but also this negatively impacted the fertility rate among the Qatari female. And the responsibility and the sense of responsibility of the current generation for raising children, the responsiveness of policies. This is a contentious matter. Some policies in states like Iceland, for example, that addressed the decrease in fertility rate by increasing paternity leave. For example, paternity leave in Iceland now is 3 months in order to take care of the child. Here, the role of the father became different. Paternity leave has been extended. This not necessarily will lead, of course, to an increase in fertility rate, but it helps. Some do not prefer to mention that, but by analyzing the questionnaire, we found that some answers, especially the answers by males, is polygamy. I know some of you do not prefer to mention that, but I see some of you smiling, but some of the answers to solution to fertility rates is polygamy. I don't know if this should be a policy recommendation or not. As I've said, this is a contentious issue. We are still in the beginning of this research project that will go over or span over a period of more than 1 year. With regards to the question of Mr. Mubarak and the World Cup, yes, the World Cup. Before the World Cup in Qatar, there was the situation of work and workers in Qatar were different but the shedding light or the attention given by international organizations on the state of Qatar started after Qatar won the bid to host World Cup 2022. As I have mentioned, perhaps the same situation as in Qatar is found in many GCC states, but light was shed on Qatar in order to negatively impact the World Cup 2022. If we look further, among the organizations that criticized Qatar with regards to the labor conditions in Qatar is the ILO. And after the blockade and during the past 5 years, the ILO opened offices in Qatar. This shows that Qatar's policies really are more inclusive for internal demands and external demands. With regards to the Omani case, I think that foreign policy is not far away from domestic policies. Foreign policy in Oman, in light of the Gulf crisis, in literature, of course, this is not. This is a term that is not used by many, but this is called Oman played negative neutrality. Kuwait played a different role as a mediator. I don't. This also impacted domestic policies in Oman. During the 5 years of research for this paper, we did not witness radical changes with regards to the rate of foreign workers in Oman. Thank you. Dr. Ahmed. Can you answer the question with regards to the level and rate of unemployment? I talked about unemployment among Qatari workforce. This is very important for labor policies. Unemployment on the level of residents, this should be nil, because all foreign workers should have a work contract in order to live in the state, to reside in the state. If there is no work contract, employment contract, he will leave the country, or he should find another source of work. With regards to Qatari workforce, these are government figures. There are individuals who are looking for work. There were 364 individuals in 2016. These are figures published by the Ministry of Development and Statistics. Hence, unemployment on the level of national workforce is 0.8% from the overall Qatari workforce. Not the population, the national workforce. We have active workers, non-active workers, active workers. We have employed. These are 101,000, and those and unemployed who have left their work but are looking for new work. And during this period, they were registered as unemployed, but these figures are in the end indicate the fact that there is no unemployment on the level of Qatari workforce on the economic level. On the social level, the inactive workers, we have the retiree, the patients, the elderly. This is something else. It's not related to the workforce. Part of them, as I've mentioned, are the virtual employment, and the labor policy of the state should look into this challenge and how can we use this workforce to that amount to 90% of the Qatari workforce. This was examined in the population policy, as they are part of the population. But in truth, they could be employed and they could be included in the Qatari workforce. Second, with regards to labor policies and the population policy, I was saying that the population policy should follow labor policies and the labor market, because the labor market determines the number of population in the state. And workforce in economy represents demand for work. Demand for labor and work determines the population later on. The more people are employed from outside of the state who come with their families, this will affect the number of population, but it will not affect if we do not take it into consideration in the labor policies. There is no person that comes to Qatar or to any Gulf state if he does not have a work contract, i.e. it should be part of demand for work. Dr. Khaled. With regards to the last question, you had a comment. I would like to give an example. We mentioned flexibility and competitiveness and how it affected integration among GCC states. The failure for a common Gulf currency has many reasons. The first is the withdrawal of the UAE from this project, because choosing Riyadh as headquarters and not Dubai. Also, when the UK withdrew from the Gulf, there was a plan to have unification between the coastal areas of Oman, Bahrain and Qatar with regards to the how a lack of unification and how it affects general policies. Yes, of course, this affects the policy of the state. The state, as we know, is our states in GCC are rentier states, and the lack of diversification affects economies, and the state. These GCC states have a social contract, and the state has to provide work for its citizens, and this of course will be at the expense of the expatriates. I am not saying that if this is correct or not correct, but I believe that the situation will continue, be it exclusion or inclusion, no matter the term that you use to describe the situation. At the end of this session, I would like to thank the speakers, Dr. Khalid Al-Khatir, Dr. Radwan Termanini, Dr. Ahmed Aref, for their contributions. I would like also to thank the Arab Center for Recent Policies for organizing this forum. I would like to thank also the participants for the interaction, their questions. Thank you.